everyone.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone. Welcome to our CWS webinar. I will give it just a few extra minutes for everyone to log in. Okay, I think we will get started. Welcome to our webinar titled Beyond Bricks, Sticks, Muckouts, and Tarps. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today and show an interest in this very important subject. Before we begin, some housekeeping items. You are currently muted, but you can ask questions by typing them into the question box at the control panel to your right. We will make every attempt to answer all of your questions. Should we run out of time, as this webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours, we will respond to your questions by email, as we want to assure that all of your questions will be answered. Before we get started with the webinar, I would just like to take a few minutes to also introduce Church World Service to you. Founded in 1946, Church World Service's mission is to end hunger and poverty and to promote peace and justice. Supported by 37 U.S.-based member communions, CWS provides programs that feed the hungry, provide clean water, reduce vulnerability, and help those forced from homes. With more than 1,000 employees in across 5 global regions, CWS operates programs in more than 30 countries. Here in the U.S., as part of our domestic disaster response program, we provide material goods in the direct aftermath of a disaster. These may be requested by any organization willing to have them distributed to survivors of a disaster. And our material goods are emergency cleanup buckets, blankets, hygiene kits, baby care kits, and school kits. Following a disaster, after the initial stages of rescue and relief efforts, many communities find there is still a long way to go to find a new normal in their communities. For this reason, we offer recovery tools and training. This is a one-day workshop led by CWS disaster specialists and leaders from denominations and other groups with information to assist long-term recovery organizations understand the efforts necessary to lead a community in coming to a new normal. And of course, we're always welcome to for consultations or community-specific training designed by community leaders and CWS disaster specialists. CWS does not have a cookie-cutter approach to training and education, but will design educational and training opportunities that meet the unique needs and desires of a particular community. And of course, we don't just disappear. We will also try very hard to be involved in the follow-up mentoring and continuing education. As our more than 6 decades of experience proves that those with the least means have the hardest time recovering following disasters, CWS disaster response activities in the U.S. focus on the most vulnerable individuals and families. We provide long-term recovery groups with small startup grants. They can be between $3,000 or $6,000. For more information, you can contact any one of us. And here's just a map that outlines our regions of responsibility. My colleague Sandra Kennedy Ose covers all the states marked in red, and Barry Shade, our Associate Director for Domestic Response, covers Hawaii and the Pacific Territories. And then all the states shaded in blue entail my region, and all the states in green were Joanne Hale's region. Our dear colleague Joanne unexpectedly passed away last August, and her region has not been reassigned as of now. So here's our contact information. Also present today is the rest of our team: Barry Shade, Associate Director of Domestic Emergency Response; Sandra Kennedy Ose, Emergency Response Specialist; and last but not least, Carol Fugi-Mpoyo, Communications Officer for Church World Service. Our webinar today will be recorded. The webinar will be available for you, if you so choose, to share with any other members of your organization in approximately 48 hours by visiting the web link listed here, www.cwsglobal.org/LTR webinars. And I will show you that link and our contact information again at the end of our presentation today. So I have the great pleasure to introduce our presenter for this webinar, the Reverend Mary Hughes Gaudreau, to you. Mary is an ordained United Methodist deacon, licensed professional counselor, and disaster response specialist. She currently serves as Director of Emotional and Spiritual Care for the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. A native of Oklahoma, she first entered into disaster response work following the 1995 Oklahoma City Murrah building bombing. Since that time, she has provided direct training, response, and consultation in more than 24 states that have experienced disasters. As past chairperson of the National VOAD, Voluntary Organization Active in Disaster, Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee, Gaudreau facilitated the committee development and ratification of the National VOAD Spiritual Care Points of Consensus. She also served as chairperson of the National VOAD Disaster Spiritual Care Guidelines writing group and was on the writing team for National VOAD's Light Our Way, a guide for spiritual care in times of disaster. She served on the Church World Service Community Arise Curriculum Committee, and most recently was also a contributor to the new book, Help and Hope, Disaster Preparedness and Response Tools for Congregations. A joint endeavor of Church World Service and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ's Week of Compassion. I will be happy to provide you with the link at the end of the webinar in case you're interested to order a copy. And now, without further ado, I will turn over to Mary for this wonderful presentation today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to show my screen and hope that that works. Let's see. Is it working?
I can see you, Mary.
Okay. Do we have the screen? All right, fantastic. I'm so thankful to Church World Service for inviting me to speak about this important topic. I'm so passionate about it, and having seen some of the list of those who are attending today, it's also wonderful to be among friends and to know that so many across the country are interested in this particular topic. It is it is in some ways daunting to try to talk to this many people. I think there were 280 signed up at one point, but there's a broad variety of experience across the country right now as we consider how we can meet the needs of those that we serve following disasters. I do want to welcome you across the country, and I want to say, having looked at that list again, I'm imagining that there are some on this webinar who are brand new to the consideration of disaster, emotional, and spiritual care, and I know for a fact there are others who are on here who are very experienced and have taught thousands of people in this particular field, and so it's a bit of a challenge. So for those who are especially adept at disaster, emotional, and spiritual care, I want to start with a bit of a commercial. This is something for you to consider in the future. Several of us who have been involved in setting policy for disaster spiritual care have put together a working summit to explore and create strategic application, implementation, and operationalization of the National VOAD Disaster Spiritual Care Guidelines. And we're hosting a meeting in Chicago, August 10 to 12, 2015, at the Central Territory Salvation Army headquarters. And so if you are especially involved in operationalizing the disaster spiritual care guidelines that just were passed in 2014, this is the event for you. I'm going to let you look here on the screen just a moment using a round table format, a round robin kind of format. We want the leaders, particularly those at state level that are making decisions about coordinating disaster spiritual care, working alongside government agencies. There are lots of punctuations and lots of acronyms here on this particular slide. If you know those acronyms, this is probably an event you want to consider. Working alongside mental health providers, negotiating conflict among disaster spiritual care providers, and training competencies and how to implement them. This is where we're having the conversation, because it's time in our country to really think about how we're going to make disaster spiritual care work in an organized format. Here's how you find out more. Go to okchurches.org. You can see the website at the bottom, www.okchurches.org. Upcoming events and trainings. Click on the National Disaster Spiritual Care Summit, and you will find information about the summit itself as well as links for the event brochure and the registration. So for those of you who are more advanced and want to have more advanced consideration, this may be the event for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. Now, that said, today's webinar is actually going to be doing an overview of some of the important parts of disaster, emotional, and spiritual care. We're going to explore why intentional spiritual and emotional care is an integral component to disaster response. We're going to review how disasters affect the spiritual and emotional well-being of those directly impacted by and responding to disaster, review some appropriate responses, learn about practical resources, and all of that is in the context of what we're doing right now in Oklahoma. A little over a year ago, I started working with the Oklahoma Conference of Churches as we are implementing an interfaith disaster spiritual care program in Oklahoma in response to the 2013 storms that came through Oklahoma. And we are using the National VOAD Disaster Spiritual Care Guidelines, and we're testing them as we do that response. So we have a lot to cover. Obviously, this is a very, very distilled topic, distilled set of things. We can't go a whole lot into a whole lot of depth with these, but we certainly will touch on each of these topics. So I want to start by thinking a little bit about why we use the word spiritual and emotional care. This particular topic uses both words. The National VOAD Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee uses both words. And I think the conversation about what's spiritual care, what's emotional care, what are spiritual care needs, what are emotional care needs after disasters is a conversation that's going to continue for quite some time. Is it spiritual and emotional care? Is it spiritual versus emotional care? Without getting too much into the weeds with that, let me just say that in the culture that we have where we're talking about this realm, disaster, emotional, and spiritual care, the two were put together when we created the National VOAD Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee, because we realized that it wasn't just spiritual care and it wasn't just emotional care. When we use emotional care, when we use that language just for the sake of our conversation today, we're thinking about emotional care as primarily the mental health aspects, the science of trauma. Now, there are certainly overlaps, and I really don't want to get into that conversation about the overlaps today. There are similarities, but they have distinct healing modalities. Both are concerned for the emotional well-being. Having attentive listening is an important part of that, and both look holistically at the person. Both work together in the National VOAD Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee. Both care for communities in disasters, and both refer to each other. Now, we have spiritual care providers, of course, are important in referring to mental health needs, and we find that that is the reverse as well. For the purposes of our conversation today, I will be primarily talking about disaster spiritual care. That's why we had so many people sign up for this webinar, because there's so much happening in that particular field today. At some point we may need to focus primarily on emotional care in terms of the mental health aspects, but today I'm primarily talking about disaster spiritual care. Now, I personally am a licensed mental health professional as well as an ordained clergy, and it's hard for me to find where those do not overlap. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're going to be primarily talking about spiritual care. You'll see, if you are hopefully familiar with Light Our Way, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, but hopefully you all have a copy of Light Our Way, which is the National VOAD document, or the National VOAD resource for spiritual care in times of disasters, for disaster response volunteers, first responders, and disaster planners. And it has this definition of the relationship between disaster, spiritual, and emotional care. Spiritual care providers partner with mental health professionals in caring for communities following disasters. Spiritual and emotional care share some similarities but are distinct healing modalities. Spiritual care providers can be an important asset in referring individuals to receive care for their mental health and vice versa. That actually is the National VOAD Disaster Spiritual Care Points of Consensus number 4. And that is also, you can see reference to that in Light Our Way as well. Now, all disasters are local, and the conversation is national. And so if you were just starting from scratch, there are 3 primary National VOAD documents that you would start with, and I hope many of you on the call are familiar with these and have perhaps read them. These were created by the National VOAD Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee. And there are 3 kinds of documents. One is a resource. Resources are tools or manuals or written resources in a particular topic. And our resource that we have within the National VOAD Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee is Light Our Way. It was copyrighted first in 2006, and again, I hope all of you have a copy of that. Many of the things I'll be talking about today are listed and mentioned and discussed in Light Our Way. The second kind of document that is core to our conversation about disaster spiritual care are the points of consensus. In our case, many committees within National VOAD, of course, have points of consensus. I think all of them may have them now, but in terms of emotional and spiritual care, we have 2 different points of consensus for the Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee. These are our ethical standards, and to be a member of National VOAD, we have to agree to these points of consensus. So the spiritual care points of consensus were passed in 2009, and these are extremely important for our work together. When I considered what to present to you, I thought about just walking through the points of consensus because this is a well-considered document, not only our ethical standards, but it's what we agree upon as all of us who are members of National VOAD. And I'm going to show you, by the way, where to find all of these documents. Now, I want to say as well, I mentioned there are 2 points of consensus. This is hot off the press. Coming soon, the National VOAD Disaster Emotional Care Points of Consensus have been updated and will be presented at the National VOAD Conference this coming May in New Orleans. They are actually on their way. That is assuming that the National VOAD Board passes them and moves them forward. But they have been out for review of the National VOAD members, and they are on their way. The National VOAD Disaster Emotional Care Points of Consensus. And the third kind of document that we have, and this is what we're operationalizing here in Oklahoma, are guidelines. These are operational, behavioral, and or ethical recommendations from the committee. And I will say to you that that particular document, I'll show you where you can find that, and many of you, I think, on the call have been working with that document, but it is an advanced document. It's really written for those with advanced experience in disaster spiritual care, those who will be planning and implementing their agency's disaster spiritual care training, programming, and ministries. And more to say about that. I will say that there is a workshop coming up at the National VOAD Conference in New Orleans to discuss more about the guidelines. It's Tuesday, May 12th, 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. If you are going to the National VOAD Conference, that might be something to attend. It will be presented by the primary guidelines writing group members, and there's a picture of the 6 that were the primary writers for that document that will be presenting that workshop. Now let me say as well that when it comes to the guidelines, these are the 3 questions that we are encouraging anyone who does training or anyone who is involved in disaster spiritual care to ask. Does the training that is being done by whoever is doing the training meet National VOAD guidelines for disaster spiritual care? If so, for what categories will providers be qualified? And finally, does the agency with which providers are affiliating meet the National VOAD guidelines as well? Now, this is clearly not yet accomplished across the country, but this is what our goal is, to work toward these 3 questions so that we can have some common operational guidelines for us to work together. Now, that's the 3 documents. I'm going to show you quickly where to find those. You can go to this particular link that's on your screen right now. There's the National VOAD.org Resource Center. I'll give you a moment to write that down. And you can also find that at the okchurches.org website. Here are some screenshots, www.okchurches.org. What we do, disaster, emotional, and spiritual care. And then you'll see there's the arrow for that. And then you'll scroll down. This is the page that you'll go to. You'll scroll down and you'll find the resources to the side there as well. So a couple of places that you can get those resources. I want to stop just for a moment to see if there are questions before we get into the content about spiritual care. Do we have any questions?
We'll give participants a few moments to type in their questions.
Well, hearing none, shall I continue?
One person says, will there be examples?
Examples of, I'm
of
wondering.
Of the type of care?
Yes, I hope so. I hope I can answer that question.
Another quick question. Oops, hold on here. Could you slow down on the screens showing links?
I will do my best. Thank you. This will also be available on the Church Will Service website.
Will the PowerPoint slides be made available or just the recording?
I'm not sure about that. I'll have to talk to Church Will Service about that.
I think if someone perhaps really wants the PowerPoint, they could write to us at CWS or to any of the CWS staff and request it and give some idea why. That would help us sort out requests, I think.
Okay. So shall we move on?
Yep, I think so. There's another question popped in, but let's grab it in the next round.
Okay, all right, I will. Now, I'm going to, this is my perspective on disaster spiritual care, and I have a few biases. I just want to be upfront about them. As a person who is directly affiliated with a faith community, it is my personal bias that disaster spiritual care belongs to the faith communities. You may disagree with that, but it's where I'm coming from in this particular presentation. It's my contention that the faith communities that have been established for some of them many thousands of years actually have the knowledge. They are the theological specialists. They have the experience in the communities, and they have the identity as those who have been providing disaster or spiritual care in general in the communities, and they are there before, during, and after the disasters. I also recognize that disaster spiritual care must fit within a complex array of systems and organizations following disasters, particularly if we are looking at shared settings where multiple agencies are working or persons of multiple faiths are present. And so while it belongs to the faith communities, in my bias, should be connected to these larger complex array of organizations and systems before the disasters so that we can more effectively provide disaster spiritual care. It's also my particular bias that there are intrinsic as well as extrinsic aspects of disaster spiritual care. And what I mean by that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but what I mean by that is that intrinsically a faith community that is involved in its community before the disaster, whatever that faith community does to help people, to assist people after a disaster, because of the faith community identity, it has an intrinsic meaning of spiritual care built into that because they're meeting the needs of people at that particular moment. There are also some specific gestures that we make, what might be called extrinsic gestures, but gestures that we make that are specifically when we see prayer, when we see providing ritual or liturgy. Those are specific extrinsic aspects of disaster spiritual care that are specific gestures that aren't just who we are, they are what we do as well. I want to say as well that is also, I feel very strongly that what we as the faith communities do directly relates to the credibility we have in the community. That to provide spiritual care, to provide care within our communities directly relates to how we are perceived as relevant within our communities, and it also directly impacts how we are perceived, especially if we are respectful of people when they were vulnerable after a disaster. And that's where the ethical standards come into play. The importance, I oftentimes say, pristine ethics. We want to have pristine ethics when we provide disaster spiritual care because it's who it is that we are and our credibility in the community. It's about the people that we serve, and it will be very evident whether or not our disaster spiritual care is about the people we serve or whether it will be about our own agendas. We'll talk some more about that in a moment as well. That's my personal bias. You might argue with me, but that's where I'm coming from today. I have a definition here from Light Our Way from my friend Naomi Pageant, and I think Naomi may even be on the call today. And this is a definition from Light Our Way about spirituality. Spirituality is the essence of life, the beliefs and values that give meaning to existence and that which is held sacred. It is one's understanding of self, God, others, the universe, and the resulting relationships. And you can again find that on page 4 of Light Our Way. I love that definition. First of all, Naomi is one of the most respected thought leaders in our field, and I think she just really summarizes it well. It is a concept that's broader than religion or faith traditions, and a spiritually whole person, spiritually whole lives have these trends: a sense of awe and wonder, a sense of community, a sense of personal mission, enthusiasm for creativity, a sense of well-being and joy. So spirituality is broader than religious, what we think of as traditionally religious. And for us here in Oklahoma, as I was trying to define what spirituality meant for our people, what I'm teaching them is when you hear issues of meaning, purpose, and hope, listening for those 3 words, meaning, purpose, and hope, we're in the realm of spirituality. Now, this particular picture, some of you may recognize, that statue stands just a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now. It is at the Murrah Memorial. And from the Christian tradition, this particular statue has a verse at the bottom of it, Jesus wept. And that particular statue sums up how we in Oklahoma were dealing with a terrible disaster. This is on right outside the grounds of the Murrah Memorial, Murrah Bombing Memorial. And we were dealing with issues of meaning, purpose, and hope, and continue to do so when we deal with tragedy. Those 3 words, and I guess you could put a 4th in about identity, but those 3 particular words, when we are dealing with those 3 words, we're dealing with spiritual issues. They're so important that one of our outreaches that we have done here in response to the 2013 tornadoes is we have printed these cards that say meaning, purpose, and hope for our community and our future, and these are cards embedded with wildflower seeds. And so we distribute these as a sign of meaning, purpose, and hope for those who've been affected and for others in our central Oklahoma who've been dealing with disasters, a number of them over the years. And we find that this is a very effective gift for people and communicates very clearly what we're about. So how disasters affect our spirituality? Well, our sense of meaning, purpose, and hope is disrupted following disasters. The questions come up. Why did God do this is a common question. Questions about justice and our previous beliefs. Why did this happen to me? Our previously held beliefs. Why are the things that I counted on previously no longer, why are those beliefs that I previously had no longer enough to help me be able to deal with this tragedy? It also affects us in terms of feelings of despair, hopelessness, guilt, and shame. And we find this very, very commonly these are clearly spiritual issues because they touch the issues of meaning, purpose, and hope. Why is spirituality relevant in disaster response? Disaster brings to the surface our deepest questions about the problem of suffering, evil, life, and death, and I see it written all over the faces of those in this picture. Our response to, in terms of spiritual care, this definition from Light Our Way I think is very, very helpful. Spiritual care includes anything that assists an individual, family, or community in drawing upon their own spiritual perspective as a source of strength, hope, and healing. In disaster, anything that nurtures the human spirit in coping with a crisis is spiritual care. Again, spirituality being much broader than particular religious beliefs or particular religious practices, meaning, purpose, hope, strength, healing. That's spiritual care. So there again we see the intrinsic assistance that we provide others by our very presence there, particularly if we have an identity as a faith community. Spiritual care in disasters includes presence of familiar agencies and symbols or emblems. Again, when the faith communities show up, when others who are providing hope, whether they have a particular faith identity, when they come and they assist people, that is providing assistance with meaning, purpose, and hope. And there are, of course, traditional religious activities, for example, ritual, liturgy, prayer, that are performed with direct intention. We always are going to be following respectfully the requests of those that we serve. We do not impose our religious activities upon others. We know as well that we're listening. If we're listening for spiritual care, we're listening for issues of meaning, purpose, and hope. Spiritual care in disasters includes many kinds of caring gestures. And know, of course, that disaster spiritual care providers may not share the faith tradition of those for whom they are caring. And so this is an important part when we talk about shared settings, of being particularly respectful of others who have a different faith tradition than we. And, of course, we care for all persons, respecting every perspective. When I do the longer trainings, we actually have an exercise where we experience what it's like to have a little bit of chaos and imagine what it would be like for someone to be trying to help us to impose their different beliefs upon us at that particular time. So here are some basic principles of spiritual care: offering presence and hospitality, meeting, accepting, and respecting persons as they are. And it's important, of course, for us to function at the levels appropriate for our training and experience. We wouldn't want someone without more extensive experience, for example, working if they don't have experience with death notification or some of the other, perhaps working in one of the more challenging settings such as the disaster mortuary. We need to recognize that some are more qualified than others to be in those especially difficult situations. We, of course, are concerned for confidentiality and discuss that in many of our documents as well. And respect and vulnerability, I'm going to talk about that with the points of consensus in a moment, but those are key. Those are key components of all that we do when we're providing disaster spiritual care. Now, I want to just give you 3 things to say. You know, this is not an extensive training that we have, but I thought if you're just beginning, it might be good to just have 3 things, all right? 3 things to say and 3 things to keep in mind. Some things to do in disaster spiritual care. 3 things to say: I'm so very sorry. That's a very positive thing to say to someone. My heart is with you might be something that's a positive thing as well. And by the way, these are listed in Light Our Way as well. And perhaps my favorite thing in starting a conversation with someone who's been affected by a disaster: where were you when this happened? And oftentimes you will get a neutral answer: I was at work. But sometimes this is the question that opens up the full conversation. And if people want to talk, this is what will open up that conversation. 3 things to keep in mind: just let the folks share their stories. Let them tell their stories. It is my experience that many, many disaster survivors just want to tell their story, and they need to tell it over and over again in a low-pressure situation where we are just present. I would advise you to be cautious about advice giving or asking lots of questions. Remember that asking questions can feel very controlling, and our job is not to give advice. Our job is to be present and to listen. And, of course, to support people in finding their own solutions. Those are 3 things to keep in mind. So these are a list of just a few things, just to tease you a little bit. If you're going to take away anything from this in terms of what to do, these are a few things that are important for us. That's on page 17 of Light Our Way, by the way. Now, I want to give you an example of what not to do. And this is a story that is really heartbreaking to me. Pamela emailed me because someone who she had worked with after one of the 2013 tornadoes told her to email me. They heard that that we were doing spiritual care training, and she wanted to make sure that everyone that I trained knew what had happened to her, and that to prevent that from happening to anyone else. And as a result of that, she sent me this email, and I immediately called her, and she specifically asked me to share this story. And so I am going to honor her and share a part of her story. This is a part of her story. I lost my son in the storms, she writes. It was early June that I ventured out into the community looking for something. I went to a local church, and the preacher walked me over to a man who said he was a chaplain set up in a tent. I told him my story, and I followed his lead out of respect. First, he had me say the sinner's prayer. Then I stood there for 30 minutes as he told me how he had dragged across many countries. He was loud, and I was dying inside the whole time. I don't even know what his intentions were. I knew there was nothing he could do with my grief. Now this story is heartbreaking to me, because that is the example of what not to do when someone is terribly hurting. It's about this person's story. It's about what she needs, not about this, whoever it was that was claiming that they were a chaplain, setting up in a tent and imposing what his agenda was upon her story. It's stories like this that drove us within National VOAD to create the points of consensus. Over a number of years, a broad variety of people, all members of National VOAD, voted on this unanimously, the points of consensus, and there are two primary points of consensus that are important for us to remember. All of them are important, but when we're talking about respect and a story like Pamela's, it's numbers 8 and number 9. Respect is foundational to disaster spiritual care. Spiritual care providers demonstrate respect for diverse cultural and religious values by recognizing the right of each faith group and individual to hold to their existing values and traditions. Spiritual care providers refrain from manipulation, disrespect, or exploitation of those impacted by disaster and trauma. Respect the freedom from unwanted gifts of religious literature or symbols, evangelistic and sermonizing speech, and or forced acceptance of specific moral values and traditions. Respect diversity and differences, including but not limited to culture, gender, age, sexual orientation, spiritual religious practices, and disability. And I remind you again, this was approved unanimously at committee level, unanimously at National VOAD board level, and unanimously at National VOAD member level as well. Tie the issue of number 8 and respect to point number 9 about vulnerability. Pamela was vulnerable. Her son had died in the trauma, in the tornado. People impacted by disaster and trauma are vulnerable. There is an imbalance of power between disaster responders and those receiving care. To avoid exploiting that imbalance, spiritual care providers refrain from using their position, influence, knowledge, or professional affiliation for unfair advantage or for personal, organizational, or agency gain. Disaster response will not be used to further a particular political or religious perspective or cause. Response will be carried out according to the need of individuals, families, and communities. The promise, delivery, or distribution of assistance will not be tied to the embracing or acceptance of a particular political or religious creed. And I remind you again, unanimous approval. It is about the people we serve. And I was chair of the full National VOAD Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee when we passed these. I saw the process that we went through. I saw the way that relationships were built. I saw the way that trust was built as we worked on deciding what it is that we have in common. And we embrace these because we know it's about the people that we serve and not about our own agenda. All right. There is one more point of consensus actually related to self-care, and I want to mention that before we move on to some other things. And actually, I think we're about to have some questions, so you might have those ready. But I do want to mention care for the caregiver. Point number 6 of the points of consensus, and I want to read it out loud. Providing spiritual care in disaster can be an overwhelming experience. The burdens of caring for others in this context can lead to compassion fatigue. Understanding important strategies for self-care is essential for spiritual care providers. Disaster response agencies have a responsibility to model healthy work and life habits to care for their own staff in time of disaster. Post-care processes for spiritual and emotional care providers are essential. And I will tell you that a great deal of the work that we're doing in the Oklahoma Conference of Churches right now has to do with this very issue. Not only are we working with a lot of the staff that have been working this disaster for a couple of years now, but we're also working with volunteers that come in who themselves have experienced disasters and now want to give back. And this is their way of giving back. But there also is a need for self-care for those who are working the disaster short-term as well as long-term. And this in itself deserves, by the way, I'll talk to Church Will Service, this particular issue deserves its own webinar. But I didn't want us to get out of here today without spending some time on this. Okay. I'm looking now to see if there are any questions about any of this content so far. Carol, do we have questions?
I think we've got a couple. Oops.
I think we've. Carol.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Sorry. I think we've got a couple.
Yes.
We've got a couple coming in right now. A couple people have reported some twangs in the audio. We're sorry about that. We're not quite sure what that's coming from.
Is it my Oklahoma accent? Is
no.
That what you're saying? Oh.
No, it's an audio. Audio's
Okay.
coming a little bit in and out, but I think the essence is coming across just fine. So I think, sorry about that. Just bear with us on that. Okay, let's see. A question about working across faith traditions.
Yes.
As persons of faith, as a person of faith, do I deny my faith tradition and beliefs when someone of like faith asks for guidance and encouragement?
I think, could you read that one more time to make sure I completely understand this?
The question as it reads is, as a person of faith, do I deny my faith tradition and beliefs when someone of like faith asks for guidance and encouragement?
I would certainly say no. We do not deny our own faith. The key for the points of consensus is unwanted conversations about faith. That's the important part. And whenever I do a longer training, we talk about a continuum there. If someone of our own faith tradition is, if we're working with them, of course we meet them where it is that they are, and those are the easier ones to deal with. The more challenging, of course, are those who are not of our own faith tradition, and we're not sure that how to approach those, and that takes some particular additional training. For our deployed teams, we have religious cultural competence trainings as well to deal with people across faith lines.
And that relates very well to another question that's coming in is there training in how to work across faiths for caregivers?
Yes, there is. In terms of where to find that training, I believe, I would just invite that person to contact me, and I'll see what I can find for them, or perhaps Church Will Service can find that. There is a multitude of training, and I think that the National VOAD is working on a training matrix to be able to discern where to find training. The National VOAD guidelines don't specifically recommend a particular training from a particular agency. Instead, we wrote them to they're competency-based. Which competencies should training meet in order for people to be sent out into the field credentialed as spiritual care providers?
Okay, terrific. Then there was just a question about the VOAD guidelines. They were developed in a wide consensus process, and yet there's talk of complying with VOAD guidelines. There seems to be a little tension there. Are these meant to be rules for going forward, or how would you answer a question like that, Mary?
Well, there's a distinction between the points of consensus and the guidelines. The points of consensus have actually more muscle, in essence, than the guidelines. The points of consensus are just a couple of pages, and to be a member of National VOAD, every member of National VOAD, and every state, by the way, is a member of National VOAD, every state VOAD, so that would include state VOADs, agrees to abide by the points of consensus from the various committees. So the points of consensus, there is an expectation of compliance with the points of consensus. The guidelines, however, are recommendations. Now, what we're finding is that those recommendations I talked earlier about that complex array of disaster response agencies. What we're finding is that the simpler we can make things for our other agencies, the better. And the more common language we can have and the more common operational guidelines that we can have as the faith communities providing spiritual care, the better that is for our relationships with the partners outside of our faith organizations. So there is a difference between points of consensus and guidelines.
Okay, I think that's it for the moment.
Okay. I hope I answered those questions. Let's move on. Let me talk to you about what's going on in Oklahoma. Do a little bit of housekeeping here on my own page here. The Oklahoma Conference of Churches has been around. Here's the web again. OK Churches has been around since 1972. It's a statewide ecumenical agency with 16 Christian denominations that have been working together, but we also have very, very strong interfaith partners and nonprofit members. The Oklahoma Interfaith Organization is officed in the same building where we are officed as well. And we also have individual houses of worship or communities of faith that are members. So the core is those 16 denominations, and but we also have members that are interfaith as well as individual. Because I'm in Oklahoma, we have a lot of individual large independent non-denominational churches, and they can be members of Oklahoma Conference of Churches as well. We also have a gathering of the Council of Communion Leaders. And this is when the leaders of those 16 denominations meet. They meet quarterly to work together on particular statements of policy as well as other projects that may arise. And so we have the leads for all of those 16 denominations working together, and they gather under the Oklahoma Conference of Churches umbrella. Now, in Oklahoma, here is a map, and you'll notice something. If you know the shape of Oklahoma, there's a lot of red right there in the middle. This is presidentially declared disasters 2000 to 2010, and I have not seen an updated map similar to this, but you can see that we have a lot of disasters in Oklahoma. In fact, so many. We've had in 10 years, we've had 30 presidentially declared disasters. That's just in 10 years. And we're coming up, by the way, on the 20th anniversary of the Murrah bombing, which a lot of us learned a tremendous amount about disaster spiritual care following the Murrah bombing 20 years ago now. In central Oklahoma, we've had a series of traumas as well. 1995 Murrah building bombing. In 1999, 70 tornadoes in Kansas and Oklahoma within 21 hours. In Oklahoma, there was an F5 that they actually changed. Following that series of tornadoes, the F scale was changed to the EF scale to more accurately judge how much damage had been done. That large one was on the ground for 90 minutes and went 38 miles. 46 were killed, 800 injured, and there were more than 900 FEMA applications. And then in 2003, a tornado tracked almost the same as the largest had in 1999. So in central Oklahoma, there was a large amount of trauma. And as a therapist, I have worked with triple hit, someone affected by the bombing, the 99 tornadoes, and the 2003 Moore tornado. Add to that, in 2013, we had not just the Moore tornado, but 3 days of storms. We had an EF4, 2 EF5s, and flooding resulting from them as well. We had direct fatalities, more than 3 dozen fatalities, and about 1,500 applications. And as many of you may know, children were killed in their school in Moore during this series of tornadoes. So a tremendous amount of trauma, a community that had been greatly affected. And so the Oklahoma Conference of Churches was invited to help lead the disaster spiritual and emotional care response, and this was our new logo. We received generous funding from United Way of Central Oklahoma. We're very grateful for that. And as a result of that, we also, at the same time what was happening is the guidelines were coming out. The guidelines were in process and were finally approved in 2014, and so having been chair of the writing group, and when this opportunity came up for me to work back home, it was time to come home again. I came home and we started working this disaster with my people. You know, all disasters are local, and it was my people this time. So what we decided to do in our response, there are a couple of categories in the guidelines. There are some training competencies for local spiritual care responders, for example, local clergy, and the more extensively trained deployed spiritual care responders or care providers. And so what we decided to do was to do a hybrid of them. We knew that we could we had the infrastructure in place, we had the backing of the Council of Communion Leaders, we had the reputation of the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, and we had a lot of need. We had a lot of need to be able to respond to the spiritual care needs of our community. And so we created some OCC-Credentialed local spiritual care responders, which is a little bit more than the local spiritual care responders, but not quite the deployed team as our starting place. We now have more than 80 OCC-Credentialed local spiritual care responders representing 26 Christian denominations and interfaith partners, plus several individual non-denominational or interdenominational churches. And they are actively working now. We are actively working in a couple of hours. We have an event in just a couple of hours. They are providing care in specific shared settings. And I will say to you that the witness to the community of faith, the witness to the community, that the communities of faith, including our Christian denominations as well as our interfaith partners, has been a powerful witness of the community coming together to provide care. They wear their own shirts. They are identified with their own particular faith community. If they have, for example, a clerical collar, they wear their clerical collar, and then they are identified by as members of the OCC local spiritual care responder team by these blue tags that you see on your screen now. We also, in fact, blue tags tends to be, people call us the blue tags because they can see us coming. We also carry badges. We are the first VOAD agency, state VOAD agency, to carry badges printed by the Oklahoma City County Health Department. And there's a sample of those badges as well. Now, we are not the only spiritual care providers working. There are other spiritual care organizations within our VOAD that are good friends and good partners for us. We happen to have probably the most interfaith and diverse group, but there are others that are working. This is where we're working currently. We, in just a few hours, have another C.A.R.T meal. This is caring and recovering together. And this is where, when we talk about self-care, these are I guess you could just say good, clean fun. The volunteers that come to help, we provide a meal. We provide a context for that. We do a little presentation about spiritual and emotional care needs. We have our FEMA Crisis Counseling Grant folks there who do a little presentation about mental health needs that might be present. And we have the families oftentimes that will come, the families for whom the volunteers have been working, and the case managers will come. And the energy at these meals is fantastic. It's connecting the survivors as well as those who are providing care in a very casual, fun setting. CART meals. We are also providing on-site care calls alongside our volunteers as well. We have been involved in preparedness events with the American Red Cross. We provide spiritual care support for them, handing out those meaning, purpose, hope seed cards. We were helping with the World Renew assessments as well. Oklahoma Conference of Churches has hosted 2 disaster mental health forums. We have a very good relationship with the Department of Mental Health here, as well as the Medical Reserve Corps Stress Response Team. And our office is also providing spirit checks with the Oklahoma Disaster Recovery Project staff. Again, part of that self-care for the staff themselves. We are continuing to work. And I want to remind you again, there were 5 long-term recovery groups following these storms, not just the more tornado. And this, I think, was a preparedness event. That was one of the workers' children that gave us permission. These are glitter tattoos that were the big hit for the day. We also provide printed material, and we've distributed probably 6,000 or 7,000 of these just to give people some resources to have in their hands. This is a familiar graphic for many of you that lets them know what oftentimes people feel following a disaster and a high-stress situation, as well as common responses that people can begin to identify. Perhaps that being thirsty all the time has to do with the stress that they've experienced. We find that this is helpful for people as well. We have wonderful partners, the United Way, again, providing our initial grant, the Medical Reserve Corps Stress Response Team, the Oklahoma Disaster Recovery Project, and, of course, we're working as part of Oklahoma VOAD. And I would say this to anyone who's on the call who is involved in their state VOAD. Know that this is an important growing edge for disaster spiritual care. How is the state VOAD's Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee going to help coordinate disaster spiritual care? That, by the way, is one of the topics that we'll be talking about at the summit in Chicago in August. We are not the only spiritual care providers within the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. How do we maintain those relationships so that we can make sure in shared settings that we have the appropriate coverage for those settings? National VOAD guidelines say it is imperative for each state and regional VOAD to have an active and engaged emotional and spiritual care committee. And I would say that we're also having conversations. I've had a number of conversations personally with leadership of several states trying to discern how to make this work in their state. Now, that is a basic overview of what we're doing in Oklahoma. I think at this point, before I go to any other resources, we'll see if there are any questions. And I'm watching our time and aware that that we are want to allow plenty of time for questions. So are there any questions up to this point again?
I see a couple more very interesting questions. How do you get the credentials you talked about, whether you live in Oklahoma or not, someone from anywhere in the country? How do you get the credentials you talked about? The questioner says, I am a licensed minister and do a lot of disaster relief.
Okay, so how does one get the credential? Well, the main thing is going to be find an agency to affiliate with. Credentialing comes from affiliation. And affiliation includes a lot of other complexities. That's primarily why we wrote the guidelines, the National VOAD guidelines. How does one affiliate with an organization in that complex array of disaster spiritual care? The last thing we want is confusion, more confusion after a disaster. So how do we affiliate with and build a plan ahead of time so that that credential is means something. You know, it's not just the credential, it's affiliation with and accountable to an existing disaster response organization, waiting until you're invited to a specific setting and knowing that your training is appropriate for that particular setting. So I think the first place to start would be to talk to the state VOAD and see who in your state does credentialing.
Okay.
Other questions?
Another question. As one of 5 church leaders on a county long-term recovery committee, how can I help the other agencies of the committee see the churches as being of more than short-term help?
Read the question again, if you would, please.
As one of 5 church leaders on a county long-term recovery committee, how can I help the other agencies of the committee see the churches as more than short-term help? I mean, I think it's, how do the churches really get across all that they have to contribute to long-term recovery?
Okay. Well, I think that there are, in terms of long time, we're almost 2 years out and we're still actively involved in and engaged in the response. There are a number of things, if we were to look at a grid of possible activities that you might have, the main thing is to and again, I'm making some assumptions about that these are individuals who are participating in the long-term recovery, so they may or may not be involved in providing anniversary services or other kinds of care. If it's a long-term recovery committee, there's probably a case management process in play. Are the case managers aware of the importance of disaster spiritual care? Have they considered how they might refer to the local clergy as well? So there are a number of possibilities, but the main thing is, and I also want to applaud this clergy person and say, the very fact that you were involved in that long-term recovery means that you are saying that in that whole intrinsic presence of spiritual care, you are saying, I'm involved in the long-term recovery because we are part of this community and we're here for the long haul, and who it is that we are as people of faith is people who want to be with people long after the cameras are gone. So your very presence is powerful, and I don't want them to underestimate the power of that very presence. In terms of activities itself, there are a number of possibilities and thoughts and plans. And again, we might, I'm open, I'll give you my contact information if you want to contact me, and I'll give you some ideas.
Here's here's another question. What can we as spiritual leaders do during the time in between disasters to be helpful in preparing for the next disaster stage as part of long-term recovery committees? In other words, spiritual and emotional care work as part of disaster preparedness and not just disaster response.
Oh, that's a great question. A couple of things come to mind, and one is local community of faith preparedness. Starting at home, starting with your own community of faith. To, there are a number of plans out there, a number of programs to help a local community of faith be prepared. Again, it speaks to our relevance as a community of faith. We are actively involved in preparing not only the individuals within our congregation or community of faith, but also our larger community of faith. Because in many parts of the country, that's where people will turn first. That's the trusted organization or the trusted gathering. The second thing I would say is that certainly prepare, so there's one thing is local community of faith. The other that I would say is certainly this, this notion of being able to be prepared and trained to be able to go into a situation after a disaster. This is the time to do it. And this is, again, I think where the guidelines, which, by the way, are 57 pages long, but the guideline, that's why we're doing lots of workshops to try to teach about the guidelines, where the guidelines can help you learn how to how to provide spiritual care in an organized manner at state and local and county and municipality level.
Okay, another question.
That one? Other questions?
Okay. Yep. Should spiritual care and physical care, addressing physical needs of those impacted by disaster, be separate, or is there an overlap?
Oh, I think there's a complete overlap there. I think that the best disaster response is a comprehensive disaster response that has partners working together. Many of our organizations will have, for example, our Southern Baptists and our Salvation Army friends are doing the feeding, but they're also having spiritual care providers right there present and available. The C.A.R.T dinners that we do, we're doing one again in a few hours. We're providing for the physical needs of those volunteers, but we're also there and present in their spiritual care as well. It goes back a little bit to there's also an intrinsic spiritual care by having a faith community identity. If we're helping people with meaning, purpose, and hope by giving them a glass of water or a bottle of water or a roof on their house, we're providing spiritual care. That said, of course, it's always important to have others who are specifically trained to be able to meet those needs, to slow down and listen to those needs. One of the best models that I have seen is to have the muck-out teams or the tarpon teams. They get the job done of getting the roof, the roof covered, and at the same time they're working alongside spiritual care providers who have a different job at hand, and that is to slow down and hear the stories. So it's the partnership is a beautiful partnership together.
Okay. Another question, is it possible for a Red Cross disaster responder who is an ordained interfaith minister train with you for disaster spiritual care?
With me as in the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, is that the question, we think?
Not sure, but you might broaden it in general.
Okay, well, the individual organization is going to make the decision about how they're going to implement disaster spiritual care and what training is going to be expected for whatever credential is provided. And the agency having jurisdiction over a particular site will also make that decision. That's again where those partnerships ahead of time, where we understand and trust each other, are going to be especially important.
Would that person be able to train with you in Oklahoma?
I think that's going to depend upon who they're affiliating with. I said earlier, that the credential is tied to an affiliated organization. And so in terms of the training itself, with whom are they going to affiliate and what training is expected by that credentialing agency? So it really is up to whoever it is that's providing the badge. And that accountability, affiliated with and accountable to that disaster response organization. What training is expected for that affiliation? A badge is not or a credential is not a free license to just go out and do whatever. A credential, at least the credential that we would provide in most other organizations, has an expectation of affiliation and accountability tied to it. In other words, when people accept my credential, they promise that they're not just going to go self-deploy. They're going to deploy, because that just adds more confusion. They're going to deploy when we send them where we're invited primarily. So again, the training is going to depend upon the credentialing organization. I don't think I've said it depends on yet, have I? That's a sign of a true disaster response veteran when you start using those words, by the way. It depends on.
All right, and then here's one more question. Is the disaster response team the Oklahoma Conference of Churches works with a C.A.R.T CISM team. And I'm sorry, I don't know what CISM is.
CISM is Critical Incident Stress Management, and we are not a CISM team. We have some who are CISM or CISD trained, but we are not specifically a CISM training. And if you look at the guidelines again, the competencies, the training competencies do not recommend any particular training. Rather, they recommend particular competencies because there is a broad variety of training. Our folks will have, on our deployed team, will have psychological first aid, which is the SAMHSA endorsed Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration endorsed training, as well as the training that our people for the Medical Reserve Corps Stress Response Team have, as well as other competency trainings.
Okay, and here's a question that is a story at the same time. While searching for local emergency services chaplaincy training, I recently found a website for a ministry that seems thoroughly active in EMS response, including disasters. The goal of the ministry is, quote, to bring people affected by any trauma to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. It was the first result that came up when searching for training opportunities. Can more be done to steer people away from these kinds of narrowly focused ministries?
Well, that is a loaded question, but what I can say is this. We can only be responsible for those with whom we affiliate, and one of the things that is an advantage of the points of consensus and the guidelines is that it opens up that conversation for how we're going to behave. Not knowing the rest of the context of that particular organization or who that is or whether or not they're national VOAD members or state VOAD members, it's really hard to comment on that. That said, what we know is that and I haven't talked a whole lot about the difference between shared settings and private settings, but the expectations for a shared setting are different than for a private setting, and you can look at that up in the guidelines as well. A private setting is within an individual community of faith and what it is that they're doing within their community of faith. And the guidelines are not designed to address what happens within that individual community of faith. The guidelines are designed for shared settings, settings where people of multiple faiths are present, where people of multiple faiths are working. And again, the guidelines are guidelines. Our experience is that that in that complex array of relationships, that trust is 90% of what it is that we need. And so building those trusting relationships with others is going to require that we behave in certain ways that are respectful, especially of those who are vulnerable.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think the other questions group somewhat as follows. There's a lot of interest in getting some links to resources and training in self-care for crisis responders, interfaith disaster, emotional and spiritual care work training and resources, the links to some key sites and documents that you've already mentioned, how to get the recording, how to request the PowerPoint, and so on. So I'm kind of guessing that we might want to work with you, Mary, to put that together into an email, and we can send that to participants in this webinar.
Sure. Well, I can give you some of the links. Again, we're trying to put many of those links on the okchurches.org site, but I know that some of them are available at the National VOAD site as well. And again, I think that there's some work being done by National VOAD in terms of the training matrix itself that will give you some leads there as well. But I'll try to do what I can. I've got a few, excuse me, I've got a few resources here to show you that might give you some of the answers to that. But I think in terms of links, we might provide those as well.
Good. That's the end of the questions for the moment, so you can go ahead with that.
Okay, let's look at resources. On page 56 of Light Our Way, Online Disaster Spiritual Care Resource Center, I don't know how active those links are, but it's a great place to start. And again, I think that National VOAD has been talking about putting together a series of links as well. That's one resource. A second resource for some great printed material is SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. There's a wonderful one there, Tips for Survivors of Disaster or Other Traumatic Events. And by the way, SAMHSA is a government agency and they pay for the printing. So that's really helpful. And in terms of the actual responses, you know, there just is such a wealth of resources here. Possible reactions to disaster and other traumatic events. Many, many resources. I just listed the government one because we've all paid for it. I also want to mention the Church Will Service Community Arise curriculum. There is a curriculum in emotional and spiritual care, on emotional and spiritual care and disasters. You can Google that, or perhaps we can put that link out there as well. And probably some of us on the call, others on the call, helped to write that curriculum. I mentioned earlier, I think Suzanne did, Help and Hope Disaster Preparedness Response Tool for Congregations. This is a brand new resource edited by Amy Gopp and Brendan Gilvin, and probably some of us on the call were contributors to it as well. And again, www.okchurches.org, under What We Do, Disaster, Emotional, and Spiritual Care. You can find other resources on that page as well. So clearly, this is my contact information, and this is the end of the presentation. We'll spend the rest of the time with questions, but clearly there are so many resources where we've scratched the surface for this conversation. And I want to say that the reason I think that this is so important is that, first of all, we keep experiencing disasters, and we recognize that that this is an important aspect of healing and hope that bricks, sticks, muck-out, and tarps cannot address alone. In the realm of disaster, emotional, and spiritual care, unfortunately, we have experienced enough high-stress, high-trauma disasters that anyone who's worked those knows that there are injuries and damage that cannot be seen just by a flyover or even on the ground. And so I'm again so appreciative of Church World Service for offering this opportunity to have this presentation. The conversation will continue. There are fantastic leaders and thinkers in this field right now, and we're all very blessed to have the places to gather where we can continue to think through and learn from each other. And so I will open this to any other questions, and then I think we're coming to the close of our time. But Carol, do we have any other questions or any other wrap-up that we need to do?
Participants, do you have any more questions at this point? We'll give them just a moment. No, I think we're caught up at this point. Certainly any additional questions can come offline, and any one of us will be glad to respond or to find the person most appropriate to respond. And we'll follow up with some information in writing as well.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I am so happy to see friends' names here as well, and others that I know will be meeting in the future as well.
Mary, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation on this great topic. I think I speak for all present. I would like the audience to have our contact information again. Please don't hesitate to write us, give us feedback. I would also like to invite you to let us know what other topics may interest you. We do webinars once a month. We actually will have our next presentation on March 9th, conducted by my colleague Sandra Kennedy-O's, and we will talk about disaster preparedness as it's still March and we're getting into spring season, and of course can always anticipate tornadoes and flooding. So let us know as well what we can do to provide you with interesting webinars in the future. Please visit our website, and thank you so very much for joining us today, and a special thank you again to Mary for this wonderful presentation. Goodbye.